not necessarily for sure that she didn't know what was going to happen and was willing to accept that a long time ago.
It's an emotional trial. And because of the victim, the victim was a 2-year-old child. And that was hard to set aside and simply stick to the facts, but I think we did that.
She called out, "I love you." And still, no one stopped. There were no sirens, no frantic neighbors, no missing child alert flashing across screens. Just silence. Days later, a fisherman noticed something drifting in Galveston Bay. A blue plastic container, sealed tight. As he approached, he saw a small shoe pressed against the side. It was still blinking. A light-up sneaker, glowing faintly underwater. Inside was the body of a little girl, unidentified, unclaimed, unseen. Investigators gave her a name, Baby Grace. But what stunned them wasn't just what they found, it was what they didn't. No school enrollment, no medical records, no family searching. In the system, she simply didn't exist. And yet, hundreds of miles away, one person was still looking. A grandmother who never stopped searching forums, scrolling headlines, hoping to see a familiar smile. One day, she did. Not by name, not by location, but by the shape of her little face, reconstructed by a forensic artist broadcast across the country. This is the true story of how a child was erased, not just from her home, but from every institution meant to protect her, and how one memory, one sketch, and one woman's persistence gave her back her name. Hello and welcome. If you're new here, please know this story is difficult but necessary. We share these cases not to sensationalize, but to raise awareness and prevent future harm. If you believe every child deserves to be seen, heard, and remembered, please subscribe. And to our returning viewers, thank you. Your shares, your comments, your voice help ensure these children are never forgotten. Let us know where you're watching from. You're part of something important. Riley Ann Sawyers was born on March 11, 2005, in the quiet suburb of Mentor, Ohio. From the moment she arrived, she was light, a small, golden-haired girl with big, curious eyes and a smile that rarely faded. She wasn't the kind of child you could ignore. Even at just a few months old, she drew people in. Her early years were shaped by complexity. Her parents, Kimberly Dawn Traynor and Robert Thomas Sawyers, were both teenagers when she was born. Their relationship was unstable. Young, still figuring out who they were, they struggled to create a home that could meet the needs of a child. That gap, however, was quickly filled by someone else, Riley's paternal grandmother, Cheryl Sawyers. Cheryl became more than a grandparent. She was Riley's anchor. In Cheryl's home, Riley blossomed. She had a place where routines were simple and love was steady. It was here she learned how to giggle at cartoons, how to dance when no one was watching, how to pretend an empty cardboard box was anything her imagination needed it to be. Riley loved stories. She would crawl into Cheryl's lap with a picture book and plead for the same tales to be read over and over again. Her favorite? Finding Nemo. She didn't just watch it. She studied it. Her eyes would light up when Dory appeared on screen. Cheryl remembered how Riley would sit completely still when that blue fish spoke, and then break into claps and laughter the moment the music started. But Riley didn't just observe the world around her. She wanted to take part in it. At just 2 years old, she had a habit of pulling a chair up next to her grandmother in the kitchen and offering to help. Most times, helping meant stirring batter that didn't need to be stirred, or spreading flour everywhere but the bowl. Cheryl never minded. For her, those moments mattered. Riley was developing fast. Her speech had taken off. She had moved from babbles to full sentences with startling clarity. She was stubborn, as many toddlers are. If she wanted something, she let you know. But there was no malice in her defiance, just personality. She had a spark, and people noticed it. Despite the challenges in her parents' relationship, Cheryl tried to keep stability in Riley's life. She created an environment where the child felt safe, where each day followed a rhythm. Meals, baths, stories, sleep. Riley thrived on that structure. At home, Riley gravitated toward music. She had her own. As soon as any melody came through the radio or TV, she'd start to sway or clap, as if her body already knew how to interpret sound. That joy wasn't taught. It came naturally. She also had favorites. Her plush toys, her books, the spoon she insisted on using even when it didn't match the rest of the set. Among those toys was a stuffed clownfish from Finding Nemo, worn at the edges from Love. That toy often sat with her during meals, sometimes during naps, and always nearby at bedtime. Her laugh was quick, high-pitched, and contagious. Cheryl would later recall that when Riley laughed, it was impossible not to smile. There are no perfect children, but Riley was loved, deeply, and she gave that love back just as easily. To Cheryl, she wasn't just a granddaughter. She was a daily presence, a routine, a bond. And then one day, that presence was no longer there. No more early mornings with sticky fingers reaching for pancakes. No more afternoons with Riley seated on the floor, flipping through her favorite books upside down just because she liked the pictures better that way. The transition was abrupt. But Cheryl couldn't have known that the normal, joyful chaos of toddler life, half-formed sentences, flour-splattered kitchen counters, and light-up sneakers on the wrong feet was slipping out of her reach. Because in Riley's world, everything seemed fine. Until it wasn't. She was just starting to talk in full sentences, Cheryl would later say. And her laugh, it was contagious. That laugh, bright, unfiltered, unashamed, would soon be silenced. And no one knew it yet. Not the neighbors, not the local agencies, not even Cheryl. At this point, Riley wasn't just a child living in the world. She was becoming someone in it, making her mark in small, meaningful ways. And while no one could predict what was coming next, the signs were beginning to fade into the background. Moments that once felt ordinary would soon become everything. In early 2007, Kimberly Dawn Traynor was still a teenager when she began spending long hours online. Juggling early adulthood with the responsibilities of a young child, she turned to digital spaces for connection and escape. That's where she met Royce Clyde Ziegler Jr. inside a World of Warcraft forum. What began as casual conversation quickly became more personal. Royce, 8 years older, offered attention and consistency, two things Kimberly lacked. Their chats moved from the game to private messages, then to calls. The connection intensified. Within weeks, it wasn't just an online relationship. It was a plan. In May 2007, Kimberly left Ohio, taking her 2-year-old daughter with her to Spring, Texas, to live with Royce. There was no formal arrangement, no custody hearing, just a quiet departure. Cheryl Sawyers, Riley's grandmother and closest guardian, pleaded with Kimberly not to take the child. Cheryl had cared for Riley daily, understood her habits, her fears, her personality. But Kimberly was determined, and once she arrived in Texas, everything changed. Royce's expectations were immediate. Riley, still in toddlerhood, was now expected to speak to him with formal respect. Yes, sir? No, ma'am? Politeness wasn't encouraged, it was required. There was no adjustment period. Royce set the tone, and Kimberly followed. On June 1st, 2007, barely a month after meeting in person, Royce and Kimberly were married. A quiet ceremony, no celebration, just paperwork and commitment. From that point, the environment inside the home began to shift. Riley, no longer surrounded by the familiarity of her grandmother's house, was now being held to expectations far beyond her age. Royce framed her actions not as those of a developing child, but as behavior needing correction. He introduced rules, routines, and consequences. A handwritten document titled Rules for Riley was later found during the investigation. In it, Royce outlined how Riley was expected to behave, how she should speak, when she could speak, and how to respond when spoken to. It read more like a performance standard than a parenting guide. Kimberly, by all available accounts, did not resist this approach. Whether out of belief, dependency, or fear, she aligned with Royce's expectations. There were no external checks, no school officials, no social workers, no doctor's visits raising red flags. Riley had been taken from a stable home and placed into a world where structure was emphasized over sensitivity, and no one was watching closely enough to see the shift. Riley was adapting to a new home, a new father figure, and a new set of rules, all at once. In Royce's eyes, this wasn't a child needing guidance. This was someone who had to conform. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, controlled, and deeply removed from the care a toddler would typically receive. And the most dangerous part, from the outside there was no alarm. Riley had been moved from one environment to another without any institutional oversight. Her voice, once vibrant and expressive, was beginning to fade behind walls that were closing in, and no one yet understood how far that silence would reach. By mid-2007, the Ziegler-Trainer household in Spring, Texas was marked by silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes from structure that overpowers spontaneity. Royce Ziegler brought with him a deeply rigid view of discipline. A man shaped by an upbringing he once described as strict for survival, Royce believed children should conform early or face consequences. He kept a handwritten list titled Rules for Riley, which detailed how the 2-year-old should speak, respond, and behave at all times. It wasn't guidance, it was compliance. Kimberly, still barely out of her teens, admitted she went along with Royce's rules to avoid conflict. She didn't challenge his methods, she didn't ask questions. Whether out of dependence or fear, she reinforced the same expectations. To outsiders, it seemed like privacy, but inside, Riley's world had narrowed. There were no play dates, no daycare, no visits to the doctor. She wasn't enrolled in any early education programs. She was learning, but only under Royce's gaze. Neighbors saw little. Co-workers heard Royce make comments about discipline that felt old school, but few questioned them. There were no calls, no alerts, no systems in place to flag concern. Every day that passed without intervention made Riley more invisible to the outside world. And inside that home, her voice, the one that used to sing, laugh, and ask for stories, began to fade under the weight of expectation. The warning signs were quiet, but they were there. July 24th, 2007. Inside the quiet house in Spring, Texas, morning began like any other. But this was the last day Riley Ann Sawyers would be seen alive. Riley woke late. Her eyes were still adjusting, her words slow. For most 2-year-olds, that would be ordinary, but in this home, governed by rules and punishments, it triggered something else. According to court testimony, Royce Ziegler became agitated almost immediately. Riley didn't answer quickly enough. Her delay, just a few moments, was taken as disobedience. Royce believed in structure. He expected complete obedience, even from a toddler. Kimberly would later tell investigators that Royce insisted Riley be placed in a cold bath as a form of punishment. Kimberly admitted she complied. The water was intentionally unwelcoming, a tactic Royce believed would drive obedience. During that bath, Kimberly reported that Royce repeatedly forced Riley to stay under the water for extended moments, each time lasting close to a minute. Riley, barely 2 years old, stood confused. The kind of confusion a toddler feels when something familiar suddenly turns uncomfortable. She looked toward the adults in the room, those she still relied on for safety, and whispered softly, "I love you." That single phrase, innocent and small, hung in the air. Kimberly stated that immediately after, Royce lifted Riley from the tub. What happened in the seconds that followed she described as sudden and violent. She said Royce became physically aggressive and Riley struck a hard surface with significant force. Kimberly claimed she froze, stunned by what had just happened. Later, during the forensic examination, experts reported that Riley's injuries were not superficial. They identified multiple fractures to her skull. The severity was compared by professionals to trauma someone might sustain from falling multiple stories, an impact far beyond what could occur in daily household mishaps. This wasn't something accidental or incidental, it was trauma caused by force. Authorities would later confirm that this event was the pivotal moment. Riley at that point fell silent. Kimberly said they waited. Minutes passed. They didn't call for help. Instead, they spoke in low tones about what to do next. That decision, to remain silent, to delay, to avoid, became as critical as the event itself. For hours, Riley remained unresponsive and presumed dead. The environment inside the home grew more calculated. The panic wasn't outward. It was quiet, deliberate, and focused on concealment. Later that same day, Royce and Kimberly drove to Walmart. Surveillance footage showed them purchasing a large plastic container along with cleaning products. At checkout, they appeared calm, collected. That evening, Riley's absence wasn't noticed by any neighbors or officials. No one knocked, no one asked questions, but that silence wouldn't last forever. October 29th, 2007. The waters of Galveston Bay were calm. That morning, a local fisherman spotted something unusual near the shoreline, an out-of-place storage container. It was weathered, sealed, and partially wedged into the sand. What caught his eye wasn't just the box, it was what was faintly visible inside. A child's sneaker. Still blinking. He didn't investigate further. Instead, he contacted authorities. When officers arrived, they noted that the container had been closed securely and appeared to have been placed intentionally. Inside was the body of a young child. No identification, no immediate clues, and no active missing persons report that matched. Investigators gave her a name, Baby Grace. It quickly became apparent that this was not a case of a lost child. Everything about the condition of the container and its contents suggested planning. Forensics indicated that the child had been inside for several weeks, possibly 2 months, before being discovered. There were no records, no alerts, no institutional links that could help identify her. But investigators had one critical piece to work with: a pair of light-up shoes. Still functional, still flashing. They hoped the shoes, along with other personal details, would be enough to trigger recognition. With no confirmed identity, the Galveston County Sheriff's Office reached out to Lois Gibson, one of the nation's most experienced forensic artists. Using detailed anatomical references and tissue data, she created a full facial reconstruction of the child. The sketch was published through media channels across the country. It depicted a girl, approximately 2 or 3 years old, with soft features and light-colored hair. She became known nationally as Baby Grace, a symbol of loss, but also of a question left unanswered. Who was she? As the image spread, tips began to flow in. Dozens of calls, then hundreds. Some thought she resembled a niece, a former neighbor, a distant student. Investigators worked through each lead, but nothing matched. No identity could be confirmed. Behind the scenes, a team at the Galveston County Medical Examiner's Office was still working. The forensic examination uncovered signs of trauma, injuries that were not consistent with an accident. The findings suggested a pattern of significant force. According to official statements, the level of trauma was compared to that of a high-impact fall, something that could not have happened in the course of normal play. There were also indicators of other stress-related injuries. The results ruled out natural causes. The circumstances surrounding the child's condition pointed to one conclusion: what had happened was not incidental. To those leading the investigation, the findings were clear. This wasn't simply a case of disappearance. It was something else, something that had been concealed and kept quiet. But despite the weight of what had been discovered, one thing remained out of reach: her name. And yet, hundreds of miles away, someone was watching the media coverage. A grandmother in Ohio, scanning through headlines and television reports, saw the sketch created by Lois Gibson. She stopped, looked again, and recognized the face immediately. Not because of the context, not because of the location, but because she had once held that face in her arms. That realization would soon spark a break in the case. But at this point in the investigation, the authorities had only a drawing, a few pieces of clothing, and a blinking light inside a shoe. Still, one thing was certain: this child had not been forgotten by everyone, and someone, somewhere, was about to come forward. November 21st, 2007. Just 3 weeks after Riley's identity was confirmed, investigators made their move. Kimberly Trenner and Royce Ziegler were taken into custody at their home in Spring, Texas. During questioning, Kimberly initially claimed that Riley had been removed by a government agency. She produced paperwork she said supported that claim. But when authorities contacted officials in both Ohio and Texas, there were no files, no reports, no official record at all. The explanation unraveled quickly. Faced with mounting evidence, Kimberly admitted Riley was no longer in the home. She described the situation as discipline that escalated. Her statements shifted multiple times, but throughout, she suggested that Royce was the one who had set the expectations for how Riley should behave. Royce's statements, by contrast, were less direct. He claimed he hadn't been home when anything occurred, that Kimberly acted on her own. But the information collected by investigators contradicted that. That same day, just hours after Kimberly's arrest, emergency responders were called to the Ziegler residence. Royce had reportedly taken a combination of substances in an apparent attempt to take his own life and avoid facing the situation. He was found conscious but in need of immediate medical assistance. He was transported to a hospital for care. At the scene, officers recovered a handwritten note. In it, Royce took full accountability. He wrote that Kimberly had only done what she was told, that the decisions were his, and that he did not want her to be held responsible. Once he recovered and was transferred into custody, however, Royce's story changed. In formal interviews, he distanced himself from the events. He stated that he wasn't involved, that he came home after the fact, and that Kimberly alone had made the decisions that led to Riley no longer being in the home. But the facts didn't align with that version. Surveillance footage showed Royce and Kimberly together at a local store shortly after the events in question. Receipts from that visit matched items relevant to the investigation. Cell tower records placed both of them at the home throughout the day. Kimberly's statements and Royce's own note pointed to involvement, not absence. Two individuals, two conflicting timelines, one child whose voice had been silenced. At its core, the case became about more than what had occurred. It became about clarity, about which version would withstand the facts, and about holding those involved responsible, not just for what was done, but for what was concealed. The courtroom sat still on the morning of February 2, 2009, as Kimberly Dawn Traynor appeared before the jury. It had been nearly 2 years since the child known to the world as Baby Grace was found near the shoreline of Galveston Bay. Now the faceless child was known, and so was the person standing trial. Kimberly faced charges of capital murder. The prosecution began by laying out a timeline, connecting her actions before, during, and after the incident. They argued that what happened to Riley wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, but a series of decisions that removed the safeguards a child depends on. Kimberly's defense offered a different version. They said the outcome was never intended, that it stemmed from parenting that escalated, not premeditation. Her attorneys pointed to her age, her inexperience, and the influence of her partner, Royce Ziegler. They framed her as someone who was overwhelmed and misdirected. But the prosecution didn't focus on age or emotion. They focused on facts. Throughout the trial, they presented interviews, handwritten notes, and audio from Kimberly's statements after her arrest.
With everyone waiting and expecting a long wait, it actually took the jury less than 2 hours to find Kimberly Traynor guilty of murdering her 2-year-old daughter, Riley Ann Sawyers.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Kimberly Dawn Traynor, also known as Kimberly Dawn Ziegler, guilty of capital murder.
With nearly everyone in the courtroom, even the bailiff, in tears, Kimberly Traynor sat as she has throughout the trial without showing any emotion as she was found guilty of murdering her daughter.
In one segment played for the jury, Kimberly described what had happened in her own words. She also explained how she and Royce attempted to shift attention away from the situation using documents that, upon review, were confirmed to be false. Investigators testified about those documents, forms Kimberly had shown to support her claim that Riley had been removed from the home by officials. That narrative unraveled quickly. There were no records to back it up. No agency had intervened. The story was fabricated. Medical experts testified about the forensic findings, detailing that what occurred could not be explained as a simple household accident. It reflected something far more severe, involving multiple actions taken over time. Still, Kimberly's defense maintained that she had not intended to cause irreversible harm. They stressed that she was reacting to pressure from Royce, that she believed his structure was helpful, even if it later became clear it wasn't. But when the jury weighed all of it, the shifting stories, the lack of transparency, the evidence of planning, the outcome was decisive. After just 6 hours of deliberation, Kimberly Traynor was found guilty of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Less than a year later, on November 6, 2009, Royce Ziegler stood trial for the same charge. Unlike Kimberly, Royce claimed he hadn't been involved, that he arrived home and found the situation already unfolding, that the decisions made had been Kimberly's alone. But the prosecution introduced a different set of facts. They shared timelines built from receipts, interviews, and surveillance video. They played excerpts from Royce's recorded statements and examined a written message he left at home the day Kimberly was arrested. In that note, Royce claimed responsibility. He stated that Kimberly had only done what she was told, and that he should be held accountable. His defense team worked to minimize the impact of that message. They described it as a reaction made in stress, but the jury was shown how Royce participated in actions after the fact, how he helped acquire items used during the concealment, how he avoided contact with authorities, and how his story changed multiple times during questioning. In the end, the outcome was the same. Royce Ziegler was found guilty of capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no eligibility for parole. There were no dramatic scenes in the courtroom, no final confessions, just two people, each now held fully accountable for their role in a case that shocked a nation. And for the jurors who listened to weeks of testimony, the conclusion was unmistakable. The jurors didn't need long to decide, it was that clear.
At the very beginning, we didn't know who she was. Now we do, and now we can never forget her.
We made a promise that day at the medical examiner's office that we will find the people who was responsible for her death, and we would bring them to justice. And that's exactly what we did.
I think for Cheryl it's difficult. She looked at Kimberly as a daughter, and she found it absolutely incomprehensible that Kimberly would be responsible in something like this.
Justice has been served today, and we look forward to presenting the next case when that day comes.
In January 2008, just months after authorities confirmed Riley Ann Sawyer's identity, her ashes were released to her paternal grandmother, Cheryl Sawyers, the woman who had never stopped searching. Cheryl brought Riley back to Mentor, Ohio, the place where her laughter once echoed in living rooms and where bedtime stories were part of the nightly rhythm. There, she laid Riley to rest beside her great-grandparents in a family plot that had long represented peace and continuity. The burial site was modest but deeply personal, a return to the place where Riley's life had truly begun. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Galveston, Texas, something remarkable happened. The quiet spot along the shoreline where a fisherman had found that sealed container months earlier was given a new name, not by the state but by the community. They began calling it Riley's Island. The name didn't appear on maps or in official records, but it didn't need to. Locals adopted it in conversation, in memorial events, and in how they remembered the space. For them, it was no longer just a point on the bay, it was a reminder. A statement that the silence surrounding one child's story would never go unnoticed again. In both Ohio and Texas, tributes followed. Candlelight vigils were held. Online forums filled with messages of sympathy, frustration, and resolve. Her image, once circulated as a forensic reconstruction, was now accompanied by her real name, her real story, and a wave of people across the country, most of whom had never met her, made sure she wouldn't be forgotten. But the impact didn't stop at remembrance. Child welfare agencies in Texas began conducting internal reviews. The central question was clear. How had Riley slipped through the cracks? How had a child become invisible to every formal system built to ensure her well-being? That question sparked a broader dialogue, one that extended beyond Riley's case. Advocacy groups, legal experts, and concerned citizens began calling for policy improvements. Among their most urgent recommendations, transparent custody tracking, a system where movement between guardians, especially across state lines, is recorded and easily verified. Public school and daycare enrollment alerts. If a child of age isn't enrolled anywhere and no record explains why, it should prompt immediate outreach, not years later. Emergency communication channels. A way for relatives, neighbors, or concerned individuals to flag potential issues even when no formal report has been filed. Something that doesn't require evidence, just a reason to ask the right questions. In the wake of media attention, Riley's story became part of training modules for child advocacy organizations. Her name was cited in policy roundtables, community forums, and even state legislative briefings. What began as an anonymous mystery transformed into a case study for reform, not because of the headlines, but because her story revealed what silence can hide and what vigilance can prevent. Today, Riley's Island stands as more than a place. It's a symbol, a reminder that awareness saves lives, that asking hard questions matters, and that even when systems fail, people like Cheryl, like the Galveston community, like you watching this, can carry the memory forward. Every share of Riley's story is a step toward change. If you've made it this far, comment for Riley and help us keep her memory alive. She said it softly, "I love you." Not in fear, not in panic, just a gentle phrase, the way a child speaks when they still believe someone will answer. Those were Riley's last known words. And after that, silence. For weeks, the world didn't know her name. She became a face on a flyer, a nickname assigned by investigators. Her story nearly lost beneath the weight of unanswered questions, but Riley wasn't forgotten, because one woman never gave up. Cheryl Sawyers, Riley's paternal grandmother, held on to hope through silence. When officials had no leads, she searched. When images surfaced of an unidentified child, she studied them, line by line, feature by feature. Something about that reconstruction struck a chord. Cheryl knew it. She felt it. And when she submitted photographs of her granddaughter to authorities, the truth finally came into focus. That moment didn't just restore a name, it brought Riley back into the conversation. Because of Cheryl, the story didn't end in mystery, it continued with answers. Because of Riley, the conversation about protection, oversight, and accountability reached new urgency. We've said it before, but it bears repeating. This was not just a story about one child. It's a lesson about what happens when systems fall short and what can happen when just one person refuses to stay quiet. A grandmother with resolve, a community that chose not to forget, and viewers like you who are listening, remembering, and standing watch. We can't change what Riley went through, but we can choose to carry her story forward, to recognize the quiet signs, to speak when something feels wrong, to ensure that no child is ever allowed to disappear without someone asking, "Where is she?" Let this be the legacy Riley leaves behind. Not just sorrow, but change. Please like, share, and subscribe. Let Riley's story be the reason we never ignore the quiet ones again. Because when a child says, "I love you," someone should always be there to hear it.